Thanks for coming out to our speaker series today. We will be announcing a going to grad school event on the 2nd of October, Wednesday, around lunchtime. So we'll look for a flyer on that. Those of you who are interested in grad school in philosophy or another discipline, we'll have faculty share our best strategies, horror stories, everything we got, we will share with y'all. So look for a flyer on that. We are honored today to have as our speaker Professor Rick Furtak from Colorado College. I did some in-depth research on the guy before he received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago and his BA in philosophy and English from Boston University, where he graduated summa cum laude. He's the author of Wisdom and Love, Kierkegaard and the Ancient Quarrel for Emotional Integrity. That's from 2005. And more recently, a book that's gotten quite a lot of attention, Knowing Emotions, Truthfulness and Recognition in Affective Experience from 2018. So please join me in welcoming Professor Furtak.
Thanks, Rod, and thank you all for being here. I am high-tech enough to have a handout and a colored paper. Please take one of these. It's just a list of quotations that I'll be touching upon as we go through. So, unlike the PowerPoint, you get to take it home, have a souvenir, but not feel like you're watching TV, which is always good. A quick word about me. I am a little bit jet lagged, so after these opening remarks, I'm going to stick to my text, because when I depart from it, I tend to ramble, and it's just the right length if I stick to it. So, the only risk is right now, before I start reading. I'd like to thank the UC Denver Philosophy Department for having me back again. It's been a little over 5 years since the last time I was involved in an event here, and I like to think of myself as a friend of the department, so it's great to share some newer work. And I know that it was posted in the Metro State Department as well, because I've got friends there, although my friends there couldn't be here today. They at least put up the flyer. If anybody is from MSU, then welcome. And all of you who are students at whatever level, it is really good to have you at this kind of thing, so keep coming to this kind of thing, and thanks for coming today. Okay, about the talk itself. So, Rob mentioned my book called Knowing Emotions, and this came out last year. It's about to come out within a few months in paperback, and that would be a great time if your library doesn't have it yet, to ask them to get it so you can check it out and take a longer look at some of what you'll be hearing here. Because what I'm presenting today is overlapping about half with the last chapter of that project. That means a few things. One is, of course, you are welcome to ask me anything about what I present today, as well as being invited to look further into that other half of that chapter of Knowing Emotions afterward. However, because it's from part of the last chapter, there's 150 pages or so of me leading up to being able to talk about what I am speaking of here today. So any questions that have to do with exactly how do you get here are certainly welcome. And then there's also the fact that what I'm presenting today is the end of my last book, and it pretty much forms the starting point for my next project. So any questions about where this is headed are also welcome. So the little blurb that was on the flyer or the poster kind of describes where I think I've arrived at the point at which I'm starting to speak here today. How I've been describing emotions, and the particular kind of challenge that's posed to us when we speak about moods, or overall attunements, or affective perspectives and outlooks on the world, and how these could be potentially truth revealing. So the manner in which we are attuned to our surroundings at any given time, the mood that we embody, opens us toward what we encounter and conditions how we take it in. Through these dimensions of our affective experience, we have a felt awareness of the way we find ourselves to be with ourselves, as Heidegger writes, and thereby at the same time how it is with beings that we ourselves are not. Thus, he concludes, every feeling is an embodiment attuned in this or that way, a mood that embodies in this or that way. A determinate sense, in other words, of how we are faring, how things stand in our world of concern. Our attunement governs what we perceive and apprehend, yet also how it seems. So far from being objectless or lacking intentional world-directedness, moods can be revelatory. Moreover, what they reveal to us are features of the objective world as well as the contours of our own perspective. An emotional attunement brings some of our surroundings to light, while also showing what concerns us and our specific way of being concerned. It is both outwardly and inwardly revealing. While one person may perceive and respond to a challenge with a mood of confidence, another is more likely to experience this challenge with nervous anxiety, or through what Merleau-Ponty calls the inferiority complex that shapes his affective attunement, and that could be deeply ingrained in his cognitive and bodily comportment, but also intensified right now due to an event as slight as just having been looked at by a total stranger in what he perceived as a demeaning way. Thus, on both the macroscopic and the microscopic levels of focus, one's entire sedimented life history, as well as a brief recent episode of emotion, can be relevant to one's current attunement toward the world. Whatever may be the present state of our affective point of view, however we are emotionally disposed, our take on things is an illustration of what Nietzsche designates as the perspectival character of existence. That to which we are attuned is only part of a larger reality, viewed through a perspective which itself is partial. There are more significant truths than could ever be apprehended from one standpoint. Furthermore, the axiologically salient features of the world with which any person has felt acquainted, even if indeed they're to be seen for one who is suitably attuned, also show how much a person's sense of reality and value is defined by peculiar features of who he or she is. The world as revealed through a distinct affective outlook must be understood as real in its own right, I think, yet also emphatically for us. The world for us is a phrase used with similar import by both Merleau-Ponty and Hilary Putnam in different contexts. Because what we are speaking about is the realm of what is emotionally recognized by any one specific person. What is at issue isn't just the world as it can be known by human beings universally, or as it appears to those within a particular society for whom it will have culturally generic features. Instead, we must be able to appreciate that the world as it is known by each of us, emotionally known by each person in a distinct way, is still recognizably the world. It is that upon which we have a point of view, that which is disclosed in our experience. Borrowing once more from Merleau-Ponty, we could say that in the encounter between us and what is, we are interrogating our experience precisely in order to know how it opens us to what is not ourselves. We must appreciate how a person's affective perspective can be biographically inflected and idiosyncratic, yet not despite, but rather due to what distinguishes it in its utmost particularity, able to provide an angle of access to what is the case, disclosing important truths about one's surroundings. If we could validate our emotional responses only by appealing to universal consensus, then it would follow that my grief upon the death of someone whom I knew and appreciated as no one else did would qualify as irrational, whereas it would be reasonable to grieve the loss of an actor or a political leader loved by many. And the significance of a person's life cannot plausibly be understood as varying this much simply as a consequence of how many others happen to know and appreciate him or her. And this is why I allude to this second passage of Heidegger's from the Sophist lecture course, where he says something can very well have universal validity and be binding universally, or within a community collectively, we might add, and still not be true. He says most prejudices and things taken as obvious have such universal validity, and yet are characterized by the fact that they distort beings. Conversely, something can indeed be true which is not binding for everyone, but only for a single individual. There's a moment in Proust's novel when the main character is overwhelmed by the realization that his grandmother is dead. Although she had passed away a year ago, it is only now for the first time that he learns that she is gone, in that her death and its meaning had not registered in his awareness until this instant. As Samuel Beckett comments in his book on Proust, it is now in this experience that he learns and knows that she is dead, and knows who is dead. The narrator had to recover her, alive and tender, not depleted by illness as she had finally become, before he could admit her dead. And the passage that is at the top of your page is the one, it's excerpted from many pages, in which this recognition is brought home to Marcel. So the woman whose kindness toward him seemed boundless, who had comforted him in moments of distress, who loved rereading her favorite book and could gaze in contented rapture for hours out the window at the sea, who reassured him of her presence by gently returning his knocks on the wall between their 2 rooms at Balbec, would now never respond to him again. All of this is included in what he knows, in knowing who has died. Earlier in my book, my point was that to register the significance of such a loss is to be grieved, so that until I begin to feel grief, my understanding of what has taken place is lacking, because I am not passionately agitated in the appropriate manner. And if we do not feel convinced that a person has died, then in an important sense, we do not know that they are dead. That's one of these claims that seems totally obvious and yet utterly weird, so I'll just repeat it as if that will make you feel good. If we do not feel convinced that a person has died, then in an important sense, we do not know that they are dead. Now, however, what is most pertinent at this point is that the person who grieves the loss of a loved one can know the significance of that person's life in feeling aware of what has been lost. Marcel's closeness to his grandmother and all the features of the relationship they shared give him a vantage point that makes him aware, as not just any other French contemporary, much less any other human being, could be aware of the distinct reality that was Bathilde's life. His affective comportment discloses aspects of the truth about this person that no one else might have glimpsed. In this case, and also in general, it seems that what we love about a person includes that elusive something, as Iris Murdoch describes it, which may be called their total vision of life, as shown in their mode of speech or silence, their choice of words, as well as their conception of their own lives, what they think attractive or praiseworthy, what they think funny, all of which contribute to making up what she calls the texture of a person's being, or the nature of his or her personal vision. And all of this is what can best, if never completely, be known by someone who loves them, not in spite of, but again, due to the accidents of circumstance that allow this someone to be attuned to whom or what is loved. For the same reason that it would be unreasonable for us to assume that those who fail to appreciate what we love have somehow gone wrong, it would be a mistake to expect everyone else to confirm intersubjectively what we find in a person, a place, a social issue, or a work of art that moves us, and which we might be uniquely able to perceive. In the experience of truth, and this is my third quote, once again referring to Merleau-Ponty, in the experience of truth, such as the significant truth about his dear grandmother's death that Marcel apprehends, if it were possible to lay bare and unfold all the presuppositions of his affective recognition, we should always find experiences which have not been made explicit, large-scale contributions from past and present. In short, a whole sedimentary history. What has made Marcel affectively disposed to feel aware of what it means that Matilda has passed away, to recognize the meaning of this other person's life, which now has ceased to be, is an intricate history of impressions and interactions that have formed his point of view on her separate existence. Many biographically subjective factors such as these are enabling conditions of his emotional apprehension. So, in such an experience, one learns or is reminded of significant truths about self and world, especially about the world of others and one's relation to it. Particular other persons are integral to our existence and well-being, as Marcel's grandmother was to his, and this renders us profoundly vulnerable. Moreover, in his grief, he discovers much about his orientation toward those whom he loves, his own way of loving and caring. That, for instance, he is in need of exactly the kind of reliability and reassurance that his grandmother gave him for as long as she was here, and that no one is always here, living or dead. In relation to less reliable, beloved others, Marcel's insecurity will bring out a possessive jealousy which he himself identifies as an anxious need to be tyrannical, applied to matters of love. So Marcel's emotional upheaval also informs him about his own fragility in relation to what he loves and cares about, regardless of whether or not this is a truth that he ever accepts. Another person, a different person, might respond to a similar loss with regret, resignation, anger, or self-blame. Each of these ways of taking in a situation emotionally is likely to reveal something about his or her entire way of being and caring. We can, in this manner, learn about our affective standpoint more broadly through particular moments of emotion. Eugene Gendlin describes, for instance, how a powerful feeling of what first seems like jealousy toward a spouse, after hearing him tell of a favorable development in his career, which is subsequently deciphered as more specifically a feeling of being left out or left behind, may demonstrate that one's own emotional comportment toward one's work is that it will not allow one to do what one really wishes to be doing. Such emotional responses can therefore promote understanding of our evaluative landscape and of the values that we ourselves hold. Becoming quite disturbed and disheartened upon hearing news about a violent battle in an international conflict, likewise, shows me that I view the conflict not as merely another frustrating geopolitical affair, as I might have assumed I did, thinking that I was only cynical about the whole matter, but rather as a terrible situation, one whose extreme disvalue is not outside the range of my concerns. In experiences such as these, I think, we see how aspects of the world and of the person are being revealed at once. And now I cite Nietzsche. Although we cannot look around our corner and experience from within what other intellects and perspectives there might be, he suggests that we ought at least to avoid the ridiculous immodesty of decreeing from our angle that perspectives are permitted only from this angle. While trusting in our own way of experiencing the world emotionally, we must also remember that it isn't uniquely or absolutely valid. Ours is not the only view of the truth, even if it is a view of the truth. There are indefinitely many affective standpoints and interpretations, as Nietzsche points out in another passage that I also cite on the page. There is only perspectival seeing, only perspectival knowing, and the more affects we bring to expression about any one thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we know how to bring to bear on the same thing, the more complete will our concept of that thing, our objectivity, be. If you're considering a tattoo that involves text, quoted from Nietzsche, then this passage from the third essay, section 12 of On the Genealogy of Morals, I think would be a good candidate. at least it deserves to be etched into your DNA, so to speak. It may be, however, that the ideal that Nietzsche is describing here makes more sense for human beings to aspire toward collectively than for any one of us to aim for. Each of us can know only so much of what is emotionally knowable, so a plurality of different affective subjects is required in order to apprehend more facets of the axiologically multifaceted world. If it is only through an attunement of one kind or another that we can attend selectively to any of the valenced features of reality, so that the fictitious ideal of pure observation from nowhere would, if possible, discover nothing, we should not conclude that a person's affective vision is flawed simply because of its partiality of focus. As Nietzsche ought to have known, it is a dubious goal for a finite being to try to view things from all sides and feel all plausible emotions about them. Another way of saying this would be that to insist that there is no subjective lens is another way of denying the fact that one has a perspective. You could say it's actually one way of holding a bias and one way of having a lens. So, for example, my shame and outrage about the institution of slavery in my own country probably blocks me from genuinely feeling sympathy for those who advocated during the Civil War that individual states ought to have the right to preserve the institution. And if I feel strongly that the massacre at Wounded Knee was profoundly tragic, I cannot probably extend my sympathies very far toward the cavalry soldiers who died at Custer's last stand, sad though their loss may have been when viewed from other points of view, such as those of their family members. Trying to spread oneself so thin as to see from everywhere is dangerously similar to the false aim of attaining a view from nowhere. And of course, Nietzsche himself invites us to question the idea that it is a kind of embarrassment and also an epistemic handicap to occupy a finite perspective. To some degree, though, we can take an opportunity to widen our emotional outlook when we love a friend who, in some respect, or maybe in many respects, views the world differently and feels differently about it than we do. To understand better this person's affective take on the world, we must endeavor to appreciate how things seem through the lens of their subjectivity. Yet, in order to imagine what another person, given her character, beliefs, and values, is undergoing, instead of what we ourselves would feel in her situation, we need to develop a sensitivity to the specific detail of the subjective stance of another. The difficulty of this task can hardly be overstated. And relying on Merleau-Ponty, again, this is the quote that begins on the first side of the page. The grief and the anger of another have never quite the same significance for him as they have for me. And even if I am undertaking a shared project with my friend Paul, nonetheless, it does not appear in the same light to both of us. We are not both equally enthusiastic about it, or at any rate, not in quite the same way, simply because Paul is Paul and I am myself. I think that would make a good tattoo as well, as long as I'm recommending these things. Text for tattoos is really, of course, this would be French translated into English, but one thing I really like about that passage, like the one where he says that the true house is not the house seen from nowhere, but the house seen from everywhere, is that he doesn't take the example of someone so distant from and incomprehensible to me, but he takes the example of a close friend who's actually sharing a project with me, and the radical otherness of this other subject is still a point worth making, and perhaps in the cases where we know someone more and more well, we also remain aware of how much they're unknown to us. The unique vision or temperament of a person is described by Ronald D'Souza as the mystery of personality, the labyrinth of another's being. As he adds, the worlds of value, that is, of emotional reality with which individual temperament and history endows us, are just accessible enough for us to know that they are irreducibly different. That's from toward the very end of his book, The Rationality of Emotion. When we do glimpse to some degree how the world appears to another person whose affective standpoint we trust, we realize that a sharing of values and perspectives and a similar sense of what is important and what is worth doing are not the only basis of our bond with each other. Rather, the specific difference in our emotional outlooks is absolutely important. This is because our own view can be broadened when we appreciate, even if we do not come to share, aspects of the otherness in another's perspective, what in their personal vision or their way of being attuned is unlike our own. Because what is at stake in our affective outlook is the apprehension of axiological reality, or the disclosure of being and value to the emotional knower. Becoming sensitive to the attunement of another person enables us to know other sides of the multifaceted truth, as well as other significant truths. At the same time, encountering different perspectives always poses a challenge and can even pose a threat to our own felt sense of how the world is, which is part of why the other represents a threat to me. Truly acknowledging other affective standpoints is never easy to do, and I think it's feasible only to a limited degree. Okay, a pluralistic and perspectival conception of truth must concur with Merleau-Ponty that a thing is not accurately seen from nowhere, but in a sense from everywhere. As I mentioned above, however, neither seeing things from all sides at once nor feeling all plausible emotions about them is an achievable ideal for a finite being. Hence arise what Kierkegaard laments as the many misunderstandings that so often separate persons of different temperament, and which I included that on the page as well. In the following narrative excerpts from a favorite novel of mine, although I'll stop recommending tattoos. This went from Czech into French into English, so you're going for like a full back thing. So I'll stop. In these narrative excerpts from The Unbearable Lightness of Being, what is proximally misunderstood by each of two characters is how the other feels about cemeteries, based upon what features of a cemetery each is familiar with by virtue of what they have experienced. As we see, each of their affective impressions is well grounded. For Sabina, the only word that evoked in her a sweet, nostalgic memory of her homeland was the word cemetery. And this is why. Cemeteries in Bohemia are like gardens. The graves are covered with grass and colorful flowers. When the sun goes down, the cemetery sparkles with tiny candles. No matter how brutal life becomes, peace always reigns in the cemetery. Against a backdrop of blue hills, they were as beautiful as a lullaby. For Franz, on the other hand, a cemetery was an ugly dump of stones and bones. And when he said this, and showed that this is the only emotional connotation that cemeteries held for him, at a point later in the novel, in another location, Sabina was alienated from him. Sometime after their separation, Sabina finds herself feeling upset, and according to her old habit, she decided to calm herself by taking a walk in a cemetery. But she's not in Bohemia, and this time she is struck by the overdone grandeur of the gravestones. The cemetery was vanity transmogrified into stone. Instead of growing more sensible in death, the inhabitants of the cemetery were sillier than they had been in life. Their monuments were meant to display how important they were. She thought about that stone all day. Why had it horrified her so? Suddenly, she missed Franz terribly. When she told him about her cemetery walks, he gave a shiver of disgust and called cemeteries bone and stone dumps. A gulf of misunderstanding had immediately opened between them. Not until now did she see what he meant. She was sorry to have been so impatient with him. So here, seeing an aspect of the world in the way that Franz had seen it, feeling moved the way he had been moved by it, Sabina realizes that with more time, she and Franz might have grown to understand one another's affective vantage points. But as our narrative says, it was too late now. So the opportunity is lost for self and other understanding. Crucially, I think, the personal truth apprehended by each of these characters is nevertheless a truth about the world, very much there to be seen and perceived, while being available only from certain emotional perspectives. Most important of all for my theoretical account is that Franz and Sabina are not out of touch with reality due to their selective affective attention. It would be a mistake to describe either of them as if they were in the epistemic position of someone who is hallucinating or dreaming or seeing an afterimage or the like. Whatever is the basis of their misunderstanding, it arises from different ways of being in touch with the world. So, finishing up on the topic of affective temperament and truthfulness as authenticity. In developmental psychology, the term temperament is often used to describe innate emotional traits such as shyness. Sometimes this can also include factors in early childhood that influence our affective personality traits into adult life, as well as what is more likely to be genetically inherited and biologically ingrained. Whether we opt for a psychiatric or a phenomenological account of, say, the manic mode of being in the world, such an affective tendency may well have a strong basis in our inherited biology, which is not to say only in this. Yet I am using the term temperament in a sense that includes, but is not limited to, what is either innate or else acquired early in life through interactions with others and with our environment. Some social psychologists have written about temperament in such a way as to allow this to include emotional personality traits that persist, yet remain capable of undergoing shifts at any stage in human experience. The notion of temperament can thus signify a person's entire affective standpoint, her concerns and way of caring, her characteristic attunements, and her manner of responding emotionally to particular situations. Temperament, as a person's overall way of being affectively disposed, then, pertains to what William James depicts as an individual way of seeing and feeling the total push and pressure of the cosmos. In these last pages, I will consider how an emotional temperament can hang together, be true to itself, and also be accurately revelatory of the world. Coherence as an ideal in affective life means more than just avoiding or resolving blatantly contradictory evaluations and concerns, or maintaining internal consistency in one's emotional outlook. It also means being genuinely responsive to the world, so that our temperamental attitudes and forms of attunement remain true to what has deeply moved us and who we have become. No one is, or should wish to be, invulnerable to a new discovery of value that might have a transformative impact on him, making him see and feel differently than he did before. It is indeed essential to emotional authenticity that one's coherent pattern of emotions, beliefs, and values be always open to revision and change, thus making authenticity into a kind of regulative ideal. Because any state of coherence among our affective dispositions is also a stage in an ongoing process of becoming that remains unfinished for as long as we continue to live. This can include not only newly revealed significance, but later reappraisals of earlier passions, and I think each of us does this from time to time. So after, and whatever you think of this example, I am just saying, here's how she described it. After deciding to reunite years later with a former teacher, lover, and friend, Hannah Arendt described this reunion as the confirmation of an entire life, saying that her decision to visit Heidegger mercifully saved me from committing the only really inexcusable act of infidelity and forfeiting my life. Evidently, what Arendt has in mind is the significance in her own life of what she and Heidegger had glimpsed in each other, including the potential he saw in her. The fidelity to which she refers has to do with being true to the self-defining affective experience, the event of having loved and been loved in return, which had a meaning that she appreciated only later, when she saw that betraying this love would constitute a betrayal of who she had become. This newly revealed emotional insight had to be incorporated into a coherent, revised understanding of her life as a whole. What she experienced was an affective recognition of deeply felt significance from an earlier time, a significance that was renewed and wholeheartedly endorsed. What kind of truthfulness about oneself is at issue in this kind of case? I think it shares something in common with what Nietzsche describes when he speaks of how a human being can get to know himself. This is in the essay on Schopenhauer's Educator, by looking at what he has truly loved, and through this finding a law, the fundamental law of his authentic self. It involves an acknowledgement of what has mattered most to you, and how this has formed your affective standpoint, your set of concerns and way of being attuned, your distinct manner of emotionally apprehending meaning in the world. Because we are finite, we cannot appreciate everything of value, and consequently there is much that simply will not register in our awareness. We can, however, strive to be true to what has deeply moved us in our finite perspective, to be true to that for which we have felt an affinity. Profound affective upheavals bring to light our values and ideals, informing us of what someone or something means to us, how significant it still is, or is once again, or that it has become less so, thereby always revising our understanding of self and world. I say self and world both, because learning more about how my world seems by virtue of my emotional temperament is also learning more about the world. And I'm reminded of a remark by Iris Murdoch that to do philosophy is to discover one's own temperament and at the same time to try to discover the truth. When I am moved by a poem, I might clarify my sense of how much poetry means in my life, while also appreciating an aspect of this poet's work that I had not previously recognized, but which is really there, and which I can now try to point out to others, to enable them to have a similar experience. Likewise, when an account of something like solitary confinement moves me to recognize for the first time what an inhumane form of punishment this is, a significant injustice in my society becomes apparent to me, one to which I had been blind before. The way these things affect me emotionally also reveals my own temperamental perspective, what concerns me and how it does. If I am someone who cares about what is authentic and what is not in my affective experience, then I must engage in a healthy amount of self-questioning. My irascibility today must be taken into consideration when I ask myself how genuinely offensive was that remark to which I reacted. And so also must be taken into account my characteristic way of being oversensitive to this sort of thing, if indeed I am. Similarly, when a parent gets inordinately upset at a child for some minor incident of misbehavior, there may be an overall exasperation with the demands of parenting lurking underneath their excessive, momentary emotion. This is yet another reason not to tell ourselves that our emotions are irrational or that they disclose nothing true from which we could learn. And this is the next quotation on my page from this, I think, really excellent book by Thompson called The Truth About Freud's Technique, The Encounter with the Real. Simply pretending that a slight or disappointment isn't genuinely painful, or denying that we love someone whom we do, may culminate in a complex of denials strung together until we no longer know how we feel or what we believe. By the same token, it is not harmless to indulge in moments of emotional dishonesty, sentimentally falsifying some aspect of the world or misrepresenting our care for it as serious, when in fact it is temporary and superficial, especially if we never subject this response to critical examination. These kinds of self-deception can leave us in confusion about who we are and about what concerns us. The truth about my own emotional perspective is a sort of truth that cannot fail to interest me, and there exist facts about my affective outlook that I must own before I can even raise the question of whether or not I should reflectively endorse them. The real world includes the inner world, and our inward affective orientation is precisely what gives us access to outward reality. One's temperament, one's overall affective orientation or emotional way of seeing never becomes an object that we can observe because it is that through which we look. It is disclosed in the ways that the world's significance shows up for us. And insofar as we know our own temperament, we can identify what about it we should try to adjust or alter, and perhaps in the meantime, correct against, as well as the ways in which we can affirm it as revealing who we truly are and wish to be, and also what we care about and wish to care about. Of course, there is no infallibly secure ground upon which to make these evaluations and reappraisals. As Merleau-Ponty notes when he says that even in what I later come to regard as illusory love, and these are the last two quotes, even in illusory love, as I come to see it, I was at the time willingly united to the loved one. She was, for a time, truly the vehicle of my relationships with the world. When I told her that I loved her, I was not interpreting, for my life was in truth committed to a form which, like a melody, demanded to be carried on. And he points out of this kind of later reevaluation that misguided love is revealed as such when I return to my own self. The difference is intrinsic, but as it concerns the place of feeling in my total being in the world, and also as, in order to discern its mistaken nature, I require a knowledge of myself which I can gain only through disillusionment, ambiguity remains. Ambiguity remains. That wouldn't be a bad two-word tattoo. I've got only one page left, so thanks for your patience. Ambiguity remains. That is, because affective self-understanding is by its nature always a work in progress. And the point of view from which we evaluate is also that which we are evaluating. A later outlook is not for that reason necessarily a more accurate one, as any emotionally honest person must acknowledge. The sad misunderstandings that so often separate persons of different temperament, which is to say, persons, and which I mentioned above, can even exist between younger and older versions of oneself, as in Merleau-Ponty's last example. Someone who experienced during adolescence a spiritual crisis, which he later interpreted as having been nothing other than a psychotic episode, may eventually decide in his old age that he got it right the first time, that his intervening years of complacent denial were just an attempt to talk himself out of taking seriously a religious experience. And, to turn to a somewhat less weighty example, the person whose passion for television was formed in the middle of life may be right to keep in mind that during her young adulthood she would have regarded such a passion as corrupting her aesthetic standards, and to feel at least mildly bothered by this awareness even after she has changed. When we ask ourselves these questions, what is at stake is nothing less than the truth and meaning of one's own life. Yet, and this I think is my overall point here, a fallible capacity can still be one that enables us to know. And I think it is only through our emotions that we perceive meaning in life. By feeling emotions that we are able to recognize the value of significance of anything whatsoever. Furthermore, the kind of knowledge that our affective responses and dispositions are capable of providing to us is distinct from what other modes of knowing can bring. In other words, you just can't have access to it any other way. What our emotions reveal is our sense of reality and value. In other words, to return to the words of Proust's narrator, reality as we have felt it to be. Whether or not this seems like something well worth knowing about is a matter that itself must depend above all on what I have called our affective temperament. To take seriously what can be known through our emotions, the person must believe in truth, in truthfulness, and in the meaning of an individual life. This paper has been an invitation to do so. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for questions and discussion.
Hey, thanks. I appreciate the talk. I also appreciate your textual sensitivity to Nietzsche. And I have a question about Nietzsche. I don't want to suggest that it's only about him, but
Yeah, can you say your name? I don't know most of these.
sorry, my name is Jeff.
Good to meet you.
Good to meet you. There's a passage in Nietzsche's Daybreak, I think it's 109, paragraph 109, where he actually describes the emotions in a similar way as you did, but he couches them in terms of being unconscious drives. And one of the things that he emphasizes there is that the drives themselves manifest as a kind of landscape, he likens it to a battlefield after the battle has been waged. So it's clear that some emotion has been felt, but the struggle that produced that emotion and the conditions under which that emotion prevailed are unknown and in fact inscrutable. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I take his point that these things that we call, Paul is Paul and I am myself, and this attunement and temperament that I take to be my perspective on these things I feel emotions about, those in fact are just drives as well. So in a way, and I appreciate that Freud came up here as well, in a way these things that we feel as emotions are products of competing drives. Mm-hmm. Even the I that expects to feel those is just one more drive that's surmounted the others. So in a way, I wonder if this complicates the viewpoint that emotions allow us to appreciate the world in a way when that word us is actually incoherent.
Great. Good. So that passage from Daybreak that you bring up is one of the places, many places, where Nietzsche does talk about passions and affects in terms of drives. And it seems to me there are a couple of points there. He says elsewhere, moralities are a sign language of the affects. And one of the things that I think that tends to imply at those moments is that the world, as we know it, is very much our world, and to that degree, I completely agree with him, that the world as we perceive it is a projection, and really is not the way that we see it, that it seems to be to us. That's something I'm pushing him on, and I'm using other moments in Nietzsche to do so, because I think that preserves exactly an ideal of knowledge as objectivity that he's trying to push against. If we think through the perspectival character of existence, not just of knowledge, that will end up not being haunted any longer by the shadow of this question, the world as it is itself versus the world as it seems to me. That very way of setting up the claim that we project value onto the world is relying upon an assumption that I think in his considered view he is encouraging us to question. That it's a drive is the other part of this. Drive in the sense of desire, unconscious desire, etc. I don't think that's necessarily wrong, but I prefer to speak of that impulse in us as an impulse simply to care, to take an interest. And that's simply a matter of conceptual priority. I think that we want X, Y, or Z by virtue of the ways in which we already care and become concerned, right? And in that sense, wishing and willing, as Heidegger says, presuppose care. In order to have some end appear to me as something worth pursuing or something that it would be good if it were brought about, I must already be invested emotionally in the world in certain ways, so it shows up as significant so that that end is a good. Which is why at the same time I want to say, if you like to speak of all of this in terms of desire, I'm talking about what you're talking about, but I don't prefer to view it as fundamentally a drive that's sort of acquisitive and end and goal directed in that way. That it's unconscious and that we can't entirely account for it, I think is entirely right. So does that problematize the nature of the subject that's attaining emotional truthfulness? Yes. But that's why ambiguities remain.
Thank you.
I hope that was a decent attempt at an answer.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about the traditional allergy among philosophers to emotions.
Yes. Maybe increasingly being over. I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, at least among the Greeks, there are some texts that turn toward the emotions as being properly disclosive. But the kind of the more dominant motif is that emotions are unruly. Reason must rule over them. But I was interested in whether it's possible to excavate that tendency in terms of an affective experience. Like, what is it that renders the emotions in general problematic to the philosopher? Is it that the emotions signal a kind of weakness, and that I want to overcome what is weak in myself, such that I have disdain for these things in myself, these affects? Because presumably, that's also part of the real world, right? Like that, the way in which I can distance something in myself and calling reason from emotions. There's something about human experience that answers to that judgment and calls for it, even if now we're trying to overcome it. It's there as something to be overcome. It's a perspective that we're trying to get past, right? So I'm wondering how to think about that.
Great.
I want to say one thing to help you.
Oh,
that
good.
is an emotion itself. The disdain, so this you don't stop. And anyway, so now we can tell you that.
Yeah. Okay. So some classical sources for the philosophical distrust of emotions would include Stoicism, of course, where the idea is not that emotions are bad because they're tumultuous, but that they're tumultuous because they're false. They're getting the world wrong. They're distorting our view of things. Or a dialogue, and I know the evidence varies in different Platonic texts, but in a dialogue like the Phaedo, the emotions, passions like fear, they're of the body, and they make the soul convinced that the truth is what the body says it is. So they're both distorting the world, and they're associated with our, not just animal nature, but our mortal, finite nature, our embodied nature. I think those are a couple of main complaints. If I could kind of psychoanalyze the basis of those complaints, I would say, yeah, what you brought up about a fear of the vulnerability that emotions entail, absolutely that's a factor. The disdain toward the emotions, as Candace said, is itself an emotion. When Kant says, I cannot love because I will to, and therefore let's distrust love, well, he's showing, I think, that resistance to vulnerability. He's a fucking control freak. I said I was jet lagged, I didn't. Any excuse for all these recommended tattoos. You get one, that is your commitment. It's not my fault. We're dropping the F-bomb on Kant, however much you might deserve it. But yeah. Obviously, without becoming too confessional, I get into some pretty personal stuff in what I just presented to you in the last chapter of this book in general. The great thing about a literary text is that it's something we can all talk about without just talking about our own stuff. And so my next project, actually, as you know, is with Proust, and you heard more about Proust today than you might have been expecting to. So that's a great example of a literary text through which we can look at a narrator who himself is a control freak and doesn't like the vulnerability that emotions entail, and yet he recognizes, and here's one of the things that Marcel says in this incredible passage upon learning of his grandmother's death. He says, if I ever extracted something true from life, I knew it could only come from this kind of overwhelming impression. That's where he's right. And he's resisting it and resisting it and resisting it because we don't like being overwhelmed. But then, being overwhelmed can be a source of truth is what I'm claiming. And to finally bring this back to the ancient context, so I'm not just complaining that the philosophers have perennially and always gotten this wrong. I don't think they've always gotten this wrong. I think in Aristotle's notion of the phronimos, there's an ideal of emotions as revelatory. It's easy to get angry, but to get angry to the right degree, at the right person, for the right reasons, etc., etc. Well, that's difficult. That is virtuous. As a matter of fact, as some of you probably know, this first Heidegger passage that's on the handout, just the second quote on the page, comes from a section of a Heidegger lecture course that's supposed to be on Plato's Sophist, but the best part of which is actually on Aristotle's ethics. And it's Aristotle that he's talking about here when he makes the point that truth as consensus, truth as objective correctness, isn't simply going to suffice, because we can have truths that are relevant for only one person. And he's taking Aristotle in a certain direction with that claim, but it's a direction I clearly want to follow. Yeah, what's your name?
Jeremy?
So on that second quote, since you brought it up, my impression of Heidegger's conversation on moods and attunement was that it was less a way in which he interrogated his knowledge of the world and more of evidence for the world having an effect on Dasein or subject, object constituents, and that later in his career he entirely dropped that language for language on like the violence of the world on the subject. And so I'm just wondering, in this lecture series, which I have had the pleasure of reading at, does he go more into a direction of arguing that moods and attunement are actually methods by which we can interrogate, I guess, like the ontology of Dasein?
Well, for what it's worth, and correct me, someone, Rob, you probably know this if I'm getting it wrong, putting me on the spot. I think that course is from 1929, 1930, the Plato's Sophist. Does that sound roughly right?
No, I think it's like 25, 26.
So it's pre.
Thanks.
I know, it's like that.
It's an empirical question.
He always says that. It might, if it's not from 2930, but in fact 2526, then that's significant, obviously, in his chronology. I'm wondering if it might be like volume 29 and 30 or 30 and 31 of the Gesamtausgabe, because those numbers are, in my mind, associated with it. You can all Google this afterward, but don't do it right now. I think this lecture course is very interesting on the concept of truth. Places where there's more to be said about attunement would include the lecture course on the fundamental concepts of metaphysics, which is from now, based on how we're placing this, a few years later. World, finitude, and solitude. He goes into depth on the emotion of boredom, but despite himself, he actually mentions love at least once in talking about attunement. Does Heidegger get away from speaking of mood and attunement in the ways that he does in Division 1 of Being in Time later in his career? I heard that as part of your question. I don't think he abandons an exploration of mood and attunement in the language of the works that come out decades later, where he's engaging with poetry and that sort of thing. In fact, I think there are continued exploration of the ways in which something like a mood can reveal the truth to us. And even when the language shifts to that of releasement, disclosure, and so forth, openness, that is a way of trying to articulate a certain affective standpoint. So, yeah, we could, if you wanted to talk afterward about where I think Heidegger is most sort of valuable on this theme in later work, then yeah, ask me afterwards. But I think that what I'm presenting here is largely Heideggerian in spirit, and it's engaging with a strain of his thought that goes from the earliest work through guess that's a pretty broad claim, considering the magnitude of the corpus. But okay, yes, I'll stick by it. Candace?
All right, I want to reach across the aisle. Anybody who knows me knows that I'm sciencey and I like talk about things in those ways and think in those sorts of ways and all of that. But I think you're absolutely right, and I think that the way that you're talking about emotions as revelatory is it's indicative of what we learn more and more as we understand neuroscience and the only ways in which we can apprehend even logic problems or math or whatever. But what I think is really, or what I appreciate the most about what you're arguing is that this is as I get, now that I'm old, or it might be now that I'm more egocentric than I was, but that knowing who I am, knowing a place, like how this is constructed, and that's a thing to know, and it's when we do know that. I mean, we revise it when we have these encounters. I like the Arendt example for that, because that really does show, after all of her, everything that she's gone through and everything she's thought about and all of that, she goes back and she's like, oh yeah, but that actually is part of who I am, and that's important knowledge. And I think it's a kind of knowledge because it's not about how to build something, or that, as they're always asking the bench scientists, like, they want to know because they want to know. My dentist always, he did a fellowship at the NIH, and he said the greatest thing ever was that we sat on Fridays and people presented new knowledge, and there was like the most incredible thing but because it doesn't matter. I mean, knowledge is knowledge, and this, I mean, if anything is knowledge, and we could have that conversation whether we ever have any, but if anything is, this is just as much as every other kind, right? So I think that is it really, is that the piece of truth that you're talking about, that you're most concerned with, is knowledge of ourselves through this? Because it does show us a different aspect of the world. Certainly when I'm all pissy because I didn't sleep or whatever, and then a kid does something and I snap and I'm like, because you're an idiot and you didn't listen. Well, that's really not what that is, right? But then I'm like, oh wait, I'm not sleeping, and so I do this when I'm not sleeping or whatever. That's knowledge, right? I mean, is that what the piece that you're talking?
Yeah, and as someone who does not have children but does have pets, I don't think this is the same as having children, but due to the example of, just as you said, being kind of pissy on a given day, pets can be kind of annoying, in addition to being charming and wonderful and everything else that they are. If you find on a given day that your pet or pets are really annoying you, and they usually don't, then the difference is probably not in the pets, right? They're probably the same every day, and there's something about you this day. You're irritable, or whatever it might be. Part of how I build up to what I presented here is by going, tiptoeing through the very, simple cases of getting angry or annoyed or becoming afraid in a given context. Can that be truth revealing? What about when you sort of know that something's harmless, but you're sort of feeling afraid of it nonetheless? Does that simply show that emotion is irrational? I don't think so. And I engage with the neuroscientific literature, especially in the second chapter of the book, which I really hope that you'll look up. Because, some of the things people will say about mood, attunement, and temperament are just versions of the same claim that emotions are irrational in the simple cases of anger and fear and so forth. Writ large, well, we're not sure that we can be rational in being angry or fearful if we don't think that anger or fear can be truthful experiences of something that's really out there in the world. Then all the more problematic are moods, right? Which may not be about anything in particular, but more like about everything. So those who would, and maybe some of you are thinking this and haven't raised your hands yet, those who would say, whoa, wait a minute, what is this highly personal, emotional truth you're talking about? I'm not persuaded that even getting afraid of something that seems dangerous is going to give us truth. I do try to walk through that and lead up to this, and then sort of recklessly abandon caution here at the end, and say, this is a kind of truth that we should believe in and care about.
I think so too.
I'll maybe ask while we're on the topic of neuroscience.
What's your name, by the way?
Matt. And I wanted to ask, because I can imagine a kind of more recent source of an allergy to emotion we're talking about from our colleagues in neuroscience that would ask, so at various points in your very interesting examples, we're mentioning about like emotion as an indicator, or emotion enables us to know, it reveals these truths. And I can imagine neuroscientists that would say, well, isn't it the case that the emotion just accompanies this being revealed to us? It's not actually playing a causal role, right? It's like epiphenomenal, just kind of floating along with that. I'm just curious what you would say in response. Someone takes that approach.
Well, this is another thing that I do talk at length about in earlier chapters of the book. With relation to the neuroscientific reasons in particular, the second chapter of the book that I just recommended to Candace really, to step back from the question to a degree and just say what I'm up to in that part of the project. So there are people in philosophy that are really anti-science, and then there are people in philosophy that are like so in love with science as the key to truth. And from hearing what the latter have had to say recently about emotions, I've thought, I really don't want to just take their word for it. I want to look into this empirical literature for myself. And I did a lot of work, and my 25-page bibliography is part of the evidence of that. And what I come to, I'm trying to occupy this radical middle-of-the-road position between the science haters and the science over-enthusiasts, and actually take a long look at the evidence, but be cautious in asking what does it show, what does it not show. By the way, just within the last 2 weeks, I now have an academia.edu page, and that second chapter is one of the first few things I posted on the page under the title, The Myth of Subcortical Emotions, and you'll know what that might mean if you've looked into some of this neuroscientific literature. So, look it up. But that's not the only kind of argument I feel like I need to make in order to lead up to what I'm doing here. There are also just, thought experiments. There are the cases of things like phobias. There are those who will step in to those examples and say, okay, there's something sort of physiological that goes on, and then the reasoning follows after the fact. Then there are those who will say, no, there's always a kind of judgment that precipitates emotion, and the bodily turbulence is sort of the consequence of that. I disagree with both because I believe that it's both at once. So that if we take a look at this passage, that was the first quotation on the page that I didn't actually read out because I had talked about it earlier in the book. There's a powerful experience that's being described here. It's important that in one sense, Marcel knew that his grandmother has died. I mean, he does not fail to hold the opinion and the abstract knowledge that she is in fact deceased. It's a year later, and he says, I only now learned that she was dead. So precisely that somatic upheaval, that bodily recognition, that is needed for the rationality, for the intentionality, for the world-revealing nature of the emotion. Without the upheaval, you don't have the truth. And so that's what I'm really trying to put together and talk about embodied affective cognition as neither sort of mere feeling nor mere reason.
Thank you. I assume a chapter 2 reading group, right?
It sounds like it.
Yes. Two people. Look it up and read it. And we'll have a lot to talk about.
I'm curious what emotions do to the notion of truth itself in your paper and your book overall. Because you called it a perspectival truth, right? Then also affective recognition and knowledge, right? So I wonder where these all stand in relation to truth and whether you want to save the truth from perspectival truth, right? So whether the perspectival truth is like constitutive or like it constitutes the truth that we can speak about, right? Then I guess I can see we could fall back to that allergy again, right? Like this is perspectival, but then the truth, there is the truth of the world, right? Without engaging with any sort of affective orientation. So I don't think that's what you're arguing, right? So I would like to hear more about that, what it does to the idea of truth itself. Because I can see the, if we are talking about truth constituted by these perspectival truth, multiple truth, right? Then I can see the point of conflicts, right? Like how do we resolve that conflict then, right? And so there's that idea. And another related question would be that I see in your paper the emotions or implicit and explicit reference to death and loss. So I wonder, and then symmetry, right? And then misguided.
You're picking up on a theme.
Well, right? So I just wonder if what we consider as negative emotions have a different regulatory function, right? Like something is not right. Like so we feel that there's that lack of alignment with the world, or what we can call the objectivity. Right, objective truth. So in that regard, I think I see two questions that are related, but whichever you can share would be great on that.
Okay. There's a passage in Kierkegaard's notebooks where he simply says, an objectivity that takes shape in a corresponding subjectivity. That is the goal. I myself have not succeeded at thinking entirely beyond subject and object. But I do think these are enmeshed with each other in a way that, you're right, challenges our conception of truth. If I could back up to an aspect of Candace's question, noticing this emphasis on grief and loss and death and love and the death of love. One of the themes of this talk and of the chapter in which it is situated is aging and trying to understand oneself, especially through turbulences that have forced some reinterpretation of what one's life story is. That's always a very fragile process, and I don't want to convey it as something that's not fragile. I think that studying emotion philosophically gives us a sense of both the tragic nature of our existence and of the fragility of our composure, our ability to pull ourselves together, you might say, and know what our story is to some degree, with a healthy degree of awareness of how fallible any of these self-interpretations are. And this is the other part of what you were asking, and I really don't want to lose this thought altogether. Our notion of truth and how this challenges it. I mean, I think it's emphatically a notion of the world for us, and I want it to be both the world and for us at once. and that it's a significant world that we access through a highly perspectival, embodied comportment. That all makes us revisit the notion of what truth can mean in this context. I don't think it's simply truth as sort of personal coherence, although I think that's a big part of it. I think the idea that these experiences are genuinely revelatory of what is not ourselves is an important one to try to defend and hold on to. There's a lot that has been written about depression. By comparison, very little has been written in memoir form about mania, and bipolar memoirs tend to talk a lot more about depression. It suggests that exactly the experience of being, on the edge of a, inspiring emotional transformation are the ones that it's maybe hardest to account for. And one really good third-person narrative of mania, I can mention a first-person one if you'd like the reference afterward, but some of you might have heard of this. There's a book called Hurry Down Sunshine that's a father's description of his daughter's mania. And there's a passage I wish I knew by heart where he says basically this, and this is what I think addresses the other part of your question, at least in the way that I'm going to address it for now. We can always talk more. He says, we're all haunted by the thought that our world and the world might be hopelessly disconnected. And there's another kind of fragility that I want to do justice to here. In a way, I'm saying, let's not worry too much about that. The world is our world, and what else could it be? But I don't want to seem to be dismissing this worry. In a certain way, the whole thing I've written is because I'm troubled by that worry.
I think we have time for one last question.
Maybe two? Yeah.
I have a short one. This maybe anyway. Thinking about Augustine and Kierkegaard and to some extent Aristotle, I was wondering why you didn't address something like emotional development.
Mm-hmm.
And if in philosophy we talk about self-knowledge being often problematized by the self I was when I thought that, I now look backward and see as less informed or dogmatic compared to the self I am now, I guess in a Socratic sense. But Augustine's notion, that the wise one is the one who loves something higher in the chain of being, and the fool loves something lower. And then I'm thinking, I did a course, we did a lot of Kierkegaard, and I was talking about inwardness, and I was asking the class things like, well, don't you look back at yourself at 18 and think, well, yeah, I was not only kind of a hedonist, but I really thought that was the good life. And it wasn't until I did something like this transformation into the ethical that I thought, I get more pleasure now out of being a charitable person on Saturday morning than waking up with a hangover on Saturday morning. And so that person I am now isn't just different, but actually better. And I was surprised that I didn't hear more Kierkegaard from you, and perhaps more Augustine on this line that in philosophy, this wisdom isn't just cracking that epistemological problem that you seem to be worried about, but also figuring out what is the subject that develops. And I heard some of that when you were talking about the person that recognizes who I am in relation to how the other loves me is a self-knowledge I couldn't have without somehow understanding the perspective that the other has of me. Or I don't know if it's understanding it or empathizing with it or something, but I kind of thought you were going more in that direction, and I was going to hear some more of that, and I was kind of surprised that we got back to the sort of what I perceived to be the thesis of your paper. So I guess I'm just wondering, why isn't there more of this? Is that the fourth project in your list of projects, or the developmental part of it?
The developmental part and the Kierkegaardian parts, maybe both. You can tell me more afterward about where you think I should take this, because that's probably relevant to what I'll be working on next. I'm going to give you an answer that's brief enough that the person behind you can ask the
Oh,
next
okay, cool.
question, because I think Rob is concerned with my 10-minute
Yeah.
answers to questions. Let's keep this to a few minutes. So yeah, I mean, Kierkegaard is deeply Augustinian.
Yeah.
Does have a lot to say about the sort of personal transformation that leads us to have a revised whole affective standpoint, in light of which we now think differently about who we were before. One of the things I was trying to indicate with the examples I used toward the end is that just because a point of view is later doesn't mean that it's authoritative or better. That's the nature of the groundless ground that we're always standing upon in this kind of interpretation. I do think I said some things about development in referring to our whole sedimented history and how the roots of our embodied, we bear witness to the history of everything that has moved us. And that includes from our infancy, it includes from our adolescence, it includes from yesterday and today. It never stops unless we really become rigid. And there's a certain ideal of being human in which too much rigidity and the impossibility of being overwhelmed or transformed any longer would be a serious defect. The developmental side of this, maybe you can tell me a little bit more about how I could.
Does the transformation have a telos or not? I mean, are you going more toward that sort of, I would read as postmodernist view of this? Or are we going back to medievals and ancients where the transformation is toward that better self that I am potentially, but until the world kind of shocks it out of me, it can't come out? And I couldn't discern that from your talk, whether you were being teleological in that way or not.
Well, I mean, all of this is an expression of our capacity to love. And maybe through that capacity, Kierkegaard would say, and to some degree, I'm in agreement with him, that it's the divine that's at work in us. And that, of course, that's leading us upward toward the light if we can follow it. At least we have to hope so. So that's the teleology insofar as there is one here. Maybe I could spell that out further. As for whether it's simply, post-existential, post-romantic,
Perspectives
sort of
on
relative
perspectives.
view
Yeah.
here. I don't think it's, I think it has that flavor to it, but to a degree, what I'm doing is deeply Aristotelian. We're talking about how if you've had an upbringing that gave you a certain kind of bias, it's going to take time to change, and that sort of thing. But I'd like to get to the last
Okay,
question.
thank you.
What's your name?
My name is Mac Dan. There's like these sayings that are going around currently, well, not currently, but one saying is you're nobody till somebody kills you, and the other one is it's not, I don't have this full word, but it says, somebody who dies receives like 10 dozens of roses, which is like 10 times more than what they received when they're alive, because gratitude is stronger than love or something. So it's like, so it kind of like expresses like our perversions to the way you feel about somebody when they die. So it's like everyone's here has got like an invitation to a funeral, and you decide, do I go or not, and if you do go, you're gonna like subject yourself to this funeral and all types of emotional feelings and stuff like this. Now just a little bit on Heidegger, like Heidegger's later work, like 1945, 96, in response to Sartre's existentialism and humanism. And I kind of take Heidegger would say that this idea of attunement is similar to Sartre's stance on the humanism, which is like a form of determinism. So like, like our attunement to things is like, do we agree to subject ourselves to this? And if we do, we're just, being part of God's work and stuff like that. Or we could just kind of like repose ourselves from these feelings, but when we're attuned, we're like going into it, right? So yesterday I was talking to my friend, and we're just talking about our dads and stuff, and she's telling me her dad is like 74, and he's in this older retirement home, right? And she's kind of worried about him. And my dad was 65 a couple years ago, and he died. But then I was telling her, I don't have the problem about my dad worrying, you know. So it's like, but then so now I got all types of other shit to worry about, you know. My dad's not gonna die no more, so now it's like I got all types of other stuff to worry about, you know. So it's like where is this project going? As in, like, when we subject ourselves to this type of feelings, it's kind of like, I feel like it does kind of open this Heideggerian openness of like, where do we go next? But it's like, how do we control the attunement? You know, like, it's not just something deterministic, like we are this humanistic scientific thing that was just gonna play out, you know. Like, how do we keep thinking? Because Heidegger's response to Sartre was that you're not really thinking when you're doing the humanism, because it's deterministic, you know.
Well, great. So you referred to the letter on humanism.
Well, I'm sorry. Heidegger's response to letter on humanism, which is the letter on humanism.
Letter on humanism in response to Sartre. Yeah. I'm sympathetic to the broad outlines of the critique there, but to me, what's a text more relevant to what I'm doing here is the 1944 essay, which is translated as "What are poets for?" Basically just like why poets, where he talks in particular about Rilke. Very much in connection with openness.
I'm sorry, could you still
well, he speaks about Rainer Maria Rilke.
Okay.
And does so, I think, really well in relation to these themes of openness, attunement, and also of mourning and loss and love and what has not been understood through love. I've written about that as well. And so I'd kind of point you that way. Most of what you're asking about pertains, though, to death and mourning and so forth. There's a sense in which when someone dies whom we have loved, we just miss them and wish that they were here and feel bad for them, but they're not around anymore. It's the cessation of their experience and the finality of that. I think that's part of what hits Marcel when he realizes his grandmother is dead. There's also the sense that whatever they were devoted to in their life, their cares, loves, passions, their projects, those are finished. You know, like David Foster Wallace won't write anything else. And there's something about the finality of that makes us appreciate a person's work. I don't think this is inauthentic, because now we really realize they're done. They're no longer a work in progress. Whether there's more to it than that, I think there is, actually. So this is the last thing I'll say. One English poet was writing about another English poet who had a very difficult marriage, and then his wife died. And he wrote the most beautiful poems about his wife only after she was gone, and saw the beauty in what had been a difficult relationship. And the poet, who's taking this latter perspective, writing about the earlier one, he says, there's a chronic dishonesty in the human heart that is evidenced by how we can't fully appreciate someone who's with us in the way that we do after we lose them. And, you know, stated in the most simplistic way, that can almost sound like a banal cliche. But I actually think there's something really profound to that point. And this is one of the mysteries of finitude, death, and loss that I would like to understand better than I do.
Well, on that note, let's thank our speaker for this great. And we have still lots of refreshments outside, so people, if you have time to mill about.
Please eat stuff.
Yeah.
4:59.